electric guitars for your consideration. We're going to start off with this Ernie Ball Music Man Axis Super Sport. So what's the deal with Music Man and Ernie Ball and the confluence thereof? Music Man was formed in the early 70s in Fullerton, California. That name should ring a bell or two, and if I say it was the brainchild of Forrest White, it should be even more obvious. Forrest had been involved with Fender music since 1954 and worked his way up to being plant manager and vice president. When CBS took over, he found he didn't enjoy life under their corporate thumb, and he left in 1966. In 1971, he partnered with another Fender sales rep named Tom Walker and created a little company called Trisonics with an X. And they were working on hybrid solid-state and tube amps. They realized that they could use a little money, so they hit up an old friend named Leo. Leo Fender was very much under a non-compete clause from his sales contract to CBS at this point, so he became a silent partner in the operation. Leo didn't like the name, so they changed it to Musitech, which is also terrible. Eventually they settled on Music Man, and in 1974 they came out with some product. Unfortunately, there were some issues between Fender and his partners. He had a separate facility and a company that he set up called CLF Research. He was making the guitars under a kind of subcontract arrangement. Music Man, the other two, they were doing the amps in a different shop. Leo would ship guitars over and then they'd have them inspected before he got paid. And apparently the quality control in the finishing department left something to be desired. By one account, Leo and Tom Walker ended up having an actual fist fight about it in the office. Remember, this is a decade after Leo relinquished his first company because the stress was not good for his health. He parted ways with Music Man in 1979 and went into business with another ex-Fender employee, George Fullerton, under the name G&L, which was recently bought up and squashed by Fender in this past year. They're no longer around. So Music Man was acquired by Ernie Ball in the mid-80s. Ernie Ball had been making strings since the late 50s, and they were the ones who pioneered the plain or unwound G string for electric sets, and some of the thinner gauge sets which became popular. Around 1990, they sought to make a partnership with Edward Van Halen, who was a noted guitarist of his time, to produce a signature string set. That blossomed into a guitar with input from Eddie. He wanted a basswood body with a maple cap, a very specific shape, and most particularly an asymmetric neck carve, which is something he'd had Kramer do for some of his Frankenstein guitars, but which is a very unusual idea for a production instrument because it's kind of polarizing. You either love it or hate it. That partnership did not last very long, only a couple of years before Peavey kind of lured him away. This was not a great time for Edward. He was starting to deal with some substance abuse issues. Music Man said, whatever, the design is still ours. We'll just keep making it, and we'll call it the Axis. They changed the switch location, they slightly widened the neck, put one of a couple of different bridges on it. This one happens to be a hardtail. This one, there are various models. This one's got P90-esque pickups. And they also called it the Super Sport, which gives it the acronym ASS. These are a very particular kind of guitar. The styling is distinctive. They're still going strong, and they have a devoted following. So there's not a whole lot to do on this one. The action is okay. It's about 4/64 on the bass, a little over 3 on the treble, which oftentimes people playing these guitars want something slightly lower than that. We'll see what you can do. The issue the player's finding is there's some buzzy stuff going on in the middle of the fretboard. This is kind of interesting. I don't know the story behind these pickups, but it looks like there was a piece of tape or something on the neck pickup for a very long time, and there's a distinct suntan effect going on there. It's kind of weird. So if it doesn't need much, why am I showing you this one? Well, it's a Music Man, and they are one of the few companies that routinely use a compensated nut. I recently had a question about that. What is it? Who, from whence, and wherefore? Most of us understand that guitars with a saddle that positions all of the strings the exact same distance from the nut will play increasingly sour as you move up the fretboard, because strings stretch when they're fretted, and they are of different masses and stiffness. In acoustic guitars, this is remedied by making a slanted saddle. In electrics, frequently each string has its own saddle. The thing is, when playing strings open, they don't have to stretch. And this is part of the reason why the notes sound progressively sharp as you move up the neck. The other way to look at it is that the open string is flat relative to all of the fretted notes. About 30-odd years ago, noted classical builder Greg Byers dove into this and did some math, and around the same time noted session guitarist Buzz Featon got into the same topic for his electric guitars, trying to come up with a tuning system that allowed more harmonic agreement between chord shapes. I think it's important to say that on a fretted instrument, it's impossible to attain perfect intonation for every fret or every interval in every key. There's always compromise involved. Even with those wiggly true temper frets or the enharmonic guitars where you can move every fret position back and forth, if you change to a different set of strings, different gauges, or you move to an open tuning, those pitches will start to shift and they'll sound different, more sour. It's really interesting that the human brain can accept a certain amount of deviation from pure intervals, the fourths, fifths, octaves. But you throw a bad third or a sixth at it? No, it does not like it at all. So Buzz came up with a set of tuning parameters that try and average out those inconsistencies. Not unlike what keyboard makers had to contend with in the 17th century. You know, we can either sound great in one key or just a little bit off in all of them. There are several videos on YouTube here where James Taylor shows off his guitar collection and describes his own tuning regimen that flattens certain open strings more than others to get the same effect. What the compensated nut is an attempt to make it possible for the player to grab a tuner and tune the open strings so the little dot is green or the needle is centered and get the same effect without having to subtract however many cents for each particular string and do the math each time. Now again, it's not mathematically perfect, it can't be, but our ears like it. One practical thing is that the front edge of the nut is closer to the theoretical saddle line than standard. It's like a millimeter or so forward, shortening that distance. The scale length remains the same, but it's like we're moving the fretboard placement under it. So if you put a rule on the guitar and measure from the front of the nut to the center of the 12th fret, it's not going to be what you expect. And incidentally, for you builders out there, if you were just to shave 1 millimeter off the end of your fretboard after you've slotted it, you're going to find that the tuning discrepancy between your G and your B string, in either acoustic or electric, will be much less troublesome. Just remember to account for the change when you glue the fretboard in place, otherwise you'll mess everything up. So what it boils down to is the saddle compensation is an attempt to control tuning higher up the board. Nut compensation does the same for chords in the lower positions. You will hear people try to refute this by saying what happens as soon as you touch the string, you know, that nut compensation goes away. Not really, because, like I said, we're sort of like theoretically moving the placement of the fret under the scale length. So it affects everything rather than just open string. Every fret's going to be changed a little bit. So I'm checking out this neck. I measured the relief, which is about 5 thousandths at the 7th fret, which is pretty good. I'm also going to check out what it looks like along the entire length. I'm going to do a careful examination of the frets using a fret rocker, which is just a short piece of precision ground steel. It has a number of different lengths incorporated into the design, so that I can rock over any 3 frets. And I can see there's a bit of a rock happening on the 2nd fret here. Now there isn't excessive buzzing going on there. Towards the bass side. Then move my way up. See, there's a little bit of a rock going on the 3rd fret as well. That's actually fairly substantial. I can hear and see it over the length of the entire 3rd fret. Well, not quite. It's level down here at the 6th string. Shifting up to the 5th fret, I have to change to a different length of rocker. I'm making a little chart showing the positions of each rocking. The other thing to know is that most of these are very, very small gaps. Tiny. So small that they probably don't interfere with the string at all. When you get into a real teeter-totter effect and a good firm knocking sound, then you can be assured there's a real problem. Identifying the rocking is one thing, but discerning why it's happening is also important. In this case, we have one low fret, but if we put the rocker on the fret before it, we might be fooled into thinking that fret is high, man. So we go ahead and spot level that fret with its neighbors, and the rocker no longer rocks. Problem solved. But the next fret after it sure does. So we'll go ahead and level that one too. And before you know it, we could be doing this all the way up the board. Excessive relief in the neck can also give you the impression that frets aren't level when what's really needed is a truss rod adjustment. These are issues we see in repair. Most often when building a guitar, we work with as straight a board as we can, and any rocking is indicative of a high spot. But with strings on, things are going to change, and that's why it's helpful to do the leveling with the strings on, or in a neck jig that holds the shape when the strings are removed. At the top end of the board, usually some fall away is dressed into those frets, but that can be counteracted by kinking that happens at the body joint, causing a ski jump effect. So now I can go back with a fret rocker and check all those areas and make sure I iron them out. It's good to do this with the guitar propped up into the playing position, because gravity is enough to cause some funny things to happen if you set the guitar on its back. Some spot leveling will require recrowning. Okay, fine. Polishing, polishing, polishing. Well then, how about a Fender Stratocaster? Hold it. It's from the mid-1970s. Does that change your mind? There is a tendency among some, we'll call them theoretical collector class, that dislikes the ideas of 70s Strat. Boo! Boo! They're too heavy. They have issues. I've had my hands around and inside a lot of Strats, and there are good ones and bad ones in every year. This one is not particularly heavy. It's made of ash. What do you want? Ash is not a super light wood. You want a basswood Strat? Fine, buy a basswood Strat. I think it's charming, except for the frets. These have been dressed right down. They're about 25 to 30 thousandths with much deeper divots in the lower positions. So there's not much of them left. And I guess we need to put some new ones in. A question arises. Do we use wire of exactly the same dimensions as they did originally? In a 75 Strat, is anyone going to care? What about a 1962, though? This is a discussion I've had to have regarding some exceptionally expensive guitars recently. Not super pristine collector's examples, obviously, because they were played enough that they need refretting, but vintage in a way that means that they're worth about as much as a new Lexus, even in that condition. Is it the owner's responsibility to refret with vintage spec wire? Is it preferable to do a refret that retains the nibs on a Gibson neck that's missing half its finish and has an authentic but rewound PAF? Everyone has a different opinion. In this case, the player wants something a little taller, a little bigger, but not jumbo. And this can be helpful because, of course, Fender spray finishes its maple fretboards. Just looking at the width of the crowns here, It's probable that there's some little weirdness going on in the board here and there. You know, they've used different materials over the years for the finish, but the point is, if we wanted to change the shape of the board, we'd be sanding all the way through, down to the bare wood, do the refret, and then we have to refinish it, which is a lot of work, you know. It's much nicer to have extra height in the frets so that they can be dressed into level. In the mid-70s, they were using polyester for that finish, which is thick and hard and pretty chippy. The polyester can pose some issues because they sprayed the neck after the frets had been installed, and this puts finish over the ends of the frets, which is certain to flake off when we remove them. But it also creates a little wave or a drift of buildup, which forms in the corner between each fret and the surface of the fretboard. I've got to cut through that, or we risk, you know, great big fragments of lacquer coming off. Then, of course, this is back in the days when Fender installed its frets sideways rather than from above, which means you got to push them out sideways for the cleanest extraction. Action is 3 1/2/64 on the bass side, 4 on the treble. It's a little wonky. And relief is about 10 thousandths, which is kind of Fender factory spec for a vintage radius board like this, which is 7 1/4 radius. That's the other issue with a 7 1/4 radius, is that having taller frets would allow us to dress them into a shape that's more amenable to bending, because you're not getting more than about a half step on these before they choke out. There's evidence of different tuner bushings on here, and the surface is cracked and long linear checking, which is different from what's on the fretboard. Fretboard is a thicker finish. It's weird. It definitely seems to be two different finishes. That looks almost like regular lacquer to me. The evil 3-bolt neck system, which is just fine, assuming the neck is tight in its pocket. A replacement trem cavity cover here in pepperoni tortoise. Tilt adjust. There's a little screw that bears against this metal plate. Stamps, etc. M. Herrera, I think. And overlapping date stamps. Neck stamps are less easy to decode in this era. Okay, I'll do it. This system was in use between 1973 and 1980. 09, it's a Stratocaster. 03, with a fretted maple neck, not rosewood. 52, the last week of the year. Number 5, 1975. 1, the first day of the week. So Monday the 29th of December, probably right back after the Christmas holidays. This guitar is probably best classified as a 1976, as necks were usually produced before the bodies, sometimes several months in advance. The 5206 number is a batch code. The tuners have to come off because I'm going to be pounding on the frets and I need this large flat surface to rest against. Tapping out the frets sideways requires a certain amount of force, so I've got this padded block that screws to my bench to support the headstock. And a clamping caul, protecting the face of the instrument with a piece of paper. Score the lacquer on either side of the fret. I use a Dremel with a 2.5mm burr to cut a little recess on the end of each fret. Provides a good anchor point for the nail set that I use. This is not the only way to do this, obviously. Different people have different methods. I've seen folks use a specially ground chisel, for instance. I'm comfy with a nail set. And when I say it takes a certain amount of force, I'm not kidding. You know, you're not sort of playing patty cake. I'm using like a 16 or 18 ounce claw hammer to gently level the buildup of lacquer on either side of the fret slot. Using a razor blade scraper, I've got some tape on the blade to act as a depth stop. We call it nickel silver, but fret wire is mostly made of copper, and it turns green. Going with Stumac 152 wire, which is 48 thousandths tall by about 92 thousandths wide. It's a good wire for refrets. I like it a lot. It doesn't look out of place on an old neck. Installation goes the way it always does. I use a little fish glue in the slot. wiping up the excess here. Grab my fret jaws. Give them a squeeze. I check to make sure it's seated properly. I come back and clean up a little bit more fastidiously. Just knocking off the sharp corners. I'm going to put this one in the neck jig. I was hopeful I could retain this nut because it looked like it was in pretty good shape, but no. It's cracked right in the D-string slot. This happens to a lot of fenders. Narrow nut with a curved base. They're just fragile. When dressing the frets, I deviate from making them the same radius as the board by making sure the sanding beam follows the angle of the edges. It's not a cylinder. In effect, this makes a tighter radius at the nut and splays into a flatter radius at the other end, which I'll then go ahead and flatten more intentionally at the top end as well. Dress the ends and polish as per usual. Here I'm using some self-adhesive sandpaper on the board itself to sand the radius of the bottom of the nut slot into the bone blank. I can't really sand the edges of the neck without having to refinish everything, so I'm carefully dressing the ends of each fret tang where they emerge, trying to get them just below the surface of the finish. I'm happy with the way that looks and feels. That's ready to go. I let this settle in for a couple of days because in my experience, one thing about the 3-bolt neck and the tilt adjust system is it's not uncommon for there to be some funny little stuff going on in this region up by the neck pocket. It will settle in, but after a refret, I'll set it like this and little waves or bumps will happen. I'll have to dress those out. Now it's got taller frets. These dressed out to be about 40 to 44 thousandths, and that has lowered the action slightly. Just had to dial it in string to string using the saddle screws. And the action is now 4/64 on the bass side, a little over 3 on the treble, which is about 1.6 millimeters, about 1.2, and that's pretty low for a 7¼ inch radius fretboard. There is a threshold if you're going to shred and do wild bends, Somebody in the peanut gallery is saying, what about Yingwei? He used 70 strats. Yeah, but his action is more like 5/64 and 4. 2 millimeters, 1.5. He likes it fairly high. Then there's the slight flattening of the radius, starting at about the 12th fret and moving up. It gets closer to a 9-inch on the top of the frets, which makes bigger bends possible, something above a whole step. But again, you can't really make it behave like a 16-inch radius. It's not a Jackson. So let us plug in.